all these countries are calling what Israel's doing genocide. Brazil, South Africa, Turkey, Jordan, Pakistan, all these countries, but none of them are invoking the Genocide Convention. What the hell?
When you engage in genocide, everyone who's a signatory to the Geneva Conventions, they have an obligation.
And the Genocide Convention, yeah.
They have an obligation to do everything they can to stop the genocide, like Yemen engaged in a blockade. There's so many things you said in your analysis in the UN. I'm still backtracking on a lot you said. It was a great analysis. I'm glad you brought that information. But one thing you mentioned, how you are upset at the institutions. I have mentioned how I believe one of the biggest losers of the genocide was the UN and the concept of international law that was shown to be fraudulent. You can bypass it with might makes right. You know what I mean? But there's an overall failing of institutions. And it's very sad because I'm a big lover of combat sports and I love international soccer. I'm a big fan of Champions League soccer. I'm a big fan of the World Cup. But I literally have not been able to watch it, guys. It literally disgusts me because they allow Israeli football players to play. And by the way, in order to be on the Israeli football team, you have to serve in the IDF. So I'm not just picking on random Israeli. These are all IDF war criminals that FIFA – And I'm sad because I haven't watched this shit in like 2-3 years, guys. I love international soccer. I watched the age of Messi and Ronaldo. Like I was eating good for years. I legitimately lost all interest. Like not like like the racism, that the normalization of genocide. Meanwhile, they banned Russia. So what does that say? They banned Russia from competing in FIFA. I wouldn't even be that mad, honestly, if they had we won't ban anyone. But they banned Russia from competing in international football matches while allowing Israel to compete, sending an international message that Palestinian lives doesn't matter. It literally makes me so sick to the stomach I can't really enjoy the sport no more. But that's a side point. The whole point I'm making is about the failure of the institutions. And I want you to maybe speak more about that because you mentioned that during your opening monologue. Do you want to speak more about how you were disappointed with how the international community, and I agree, failed the Palestinians?
Yeah, well, they clearly have, but we have to get into the specifics to try to fix this damn thing. I mean, I've been meeting, with some of these delegations, and the European ones are especially infuriating because Europe has put like at least 19 sanctions on Russia since 2022. It's hard to get them to do any minor sanctions on Israel. So it's ridiculous, the level of duplicity there. My problem though has been, I and a bunch of other people pushed for a country to invoke the Genocide Convention against Israel in 2023. I actually first wrote about this back in 2014 when Israel was attacking Gaza big time then. I think that was called Operation Cast Lead. Because back then even you had countries start saying this is starting to look like genocide. So I was like, well, put your money where your mouth is. There's a remarkable law professor, Francis Boyle. He was the first person to advocate doing this. He died early this year. And then you had Michael Ratner of the Center for Constitutional Rights basically back him up back in 2014. So I started writing about this then. And then after, October 2023, then I said, okay, this is, really got to get done. So I wrote a bunch of articles saying, and I kept writing about it and trying to get people and former Nobel Peace Prize winners to be calling up these governments to get them to do something. And of course, South Africa finally did, thank God, in late 2020, like on December 29th, 2023. Yeah. They invoked the Genocide Convention, and that was excellent. And then they had a series of hearings, and the International Court of Justice issued some emergency orders. They still haven't taken on the case in full. That's going to take a couple of years. But they did issue some emergency orders telling Israel, for example, to make sure that all aid went in, and so on. And then finally, in May of 2024, so a year ago, they issued a very direct order because South Africa back then kept going back for more orders. And they said, you, Israel, are attacking Rafah. You must immediately stop your attack of Rafah. It was no ifs, ands, or buts, because the previous emergency orders, people were saying, oh, there's some ambiguity to it and blah, 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 blah. The May 24th order, there was no ambiguity. You're attacking Rafah. You began attacking Rafah on May 7th. You must immediately stop. Now, a properly functioning system, when a court issues an order like that, a court issues an order, and then the sheriff is supposed to enact it. In this case, the sheriff is supposed to be the UN Security Council. So Algeria, which is the only Arab member of the Security Council, started drafting a resolution to implement that ICJ order, which is what should happen in a normally functioning system. The US stalls this for a week, and then Biden gets up there and says, Netanyahu has agreed to a ceasefire. So we're going to make the ceasefire happen and hip, hip, hooray. Then you start seeing statements by the Israelis saying, no, not so much.
Yeah, I remember that.
So it's all this, bullshit, excuse my French, from, Biden and Blinken and so on. And then the US manages to pull together this so-called UN Security Council resolution blessing their negotiations for a ceasefire. The resolution made no mention whatsoever of the International Court of Justice orders. And this wasn't an advisory opinion. The International Court of Justice has also done advisory opinions, which are important, but they weren't orders. The May 24th move by the International Court of Justice was a direct order. And Algeria and all these other countries vote for this, piece of crap. And I was incensed, and I was writing about it, and I was screaming about it, and what the hell? So, I mean, when people say international law is a joke, you have to figure out how to use international law. I mean, it's like saying armed struggle is a joke. Yeah, I mean, if somebody takes a pin out of a grenade and then throws the pin and holds onto the grenade and it blows up in their hand, you don't necessarily say armed struggle is a joke. No, you got to learn how to goddamn use armed struggle if you're going to go down that road.
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
Yeah, know how to use your tools. Okay. Now, you don't get an order from the International Court of Justice and then not force a vote on it. And if the US wants to veto it, then let them veto it and let them be shown in front of the whole damn world as to what a bunch of lawless criminals they are. And then go to the General Assembly and try to override it. But you don't just sit there, as the Algerians and as did all these other countries. The only country that didn't vote for it was Russia. They abstained because they saw that it was a complete joke and a complete farce. And all these other countries, when they were voting for this U.S. resolution that made no mention of the International Court of Justice, they actually would talk about the International Court of Justice orders, but they weren't in the resolution that they were voting for. And the Russians called them out. You got to give them credit where you got to give them credit. They were like, this is a baloney resolution. They could have vetoed it. They didn't veto it. They claimed Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, later said that the Arab group asked him not to veto it. I don't know what the story is, but he claimed that at one point. So that's a lot. And so Biden says we're working on a ceasefire process, and they dragged it out for the rest of Biden's term. And this really shows how orchestrated this whole thing was, because they finally got the ceasefire in 4 days before Biden was to leave office. That's when Blinken had his last news conference, and when they dragged me out of the news conference. And then Trump comes in pretending to be a great peacemaker, right? I'm Mr. Peace. Right. I'm Donald Trump. Doesn't everybody love me? And then they very quietly, and that got Gaza completely off the front pages. And the story then became Donald Trump and his daily antics. And they quietly put the screws on to prevent any aid from coming in March, and then at the beginning of March, and then by the middle of March, they totally blew up that ceasefire deal. The Israelis did, and this got minimum media scrutiny. So they got to dramatically escalate their genocide while minimizing the coverage of it. The way that they orchestrated it, it's brilliant. It was brilliant. You got to hand it to them.
Yeah, the way that genocide Joe Biden was the raw architect of the genocide is understated. Because the way our great revolutionary Glenn Ford said, the Democratic Party is the most effective evil.
Correct.
And they decided to engage in the final solution for Gaza when they had Joe Biden in charge, who is the most diehard Zionist that has been in the Senate over the last 2 decades. You can't you can say you're equal. You can say they're Lindsey Graham, but you can't become a more diehard Zionist than Joe Biden. It's not possible. So once they got Joe Biden in office, after investing in him in decades, cultivating his career for decades, that's when they engaged in the final solution. And the Biden administration did everything they possibly could in order to provide cover and facilitate the genocide. And they was able to help Israel slaughter a very large percentage of the Palestinian population because of their use of regulations, had to stop the UN. Like, they're so good at political decorum, for the lack of a better term. They're good at using the institutions as a way to implement their barbaric ideology, which kind of make me worried. And I want to get your thoughts about this, because we have seen the ruling class adjust and adapt after their losses. Like, for example, you mentioned South Africa and how the international community clamped down on them. I feel like the pro-apartheid ruling class saw that shit and they learned from it. Like, you know how we have theory on the left, we have Marxist theory, we have revolutionary theory. I explained this on RBN many times before. The same way that we have revolutionary theory, the ruling class has ruling class theory. Like, they have people like Madeleine Albright, people like Henry Kissinger, who Hillary Clinton openly said is her mentor. So they have mentors. You have people who successfully engage in genocide, successfully conquer nations, and then they pass down the knowledge to the next generation of the ruling class. The same way that whenever a generation of the ruling class suffers a brutal defeat, that's when they're like, okay, we gotta learn our lesson from that and make sure they're not repeated. And I want to hear your thoughts on this, because we're seeing the Zionist ruling class study what happened with South Africa and learning from the mistakes with South Africa. We're seeing Biden manipulating the international rule of law to keep Israel freed up to commit their crimes. And now you have a coordinated attack by not only just Trump, because the liberal media, they will phrase this as just a Trump thing. But whenever you listen to MSNBC and CNN, whenever they talk about Trump's attacks on the UN, they will say, well, technically, Trump does has a point on some of these criticism, because you know that's why liberalism exists, in order to enable and justify the fascism that comes from the right. But it's a coordinated attack by the ruling class. That's why both Democrats and Republicans support the sanctioning the ICC by the Trump administration. I'm trying to find that receipt right now. I can't find it. I want to ask you about that. Between Trump escalating their sanctions attack on the ICC and Trump openly attacking the UN as an anti-Semitic body and offensively going after it, do you see the threat to international law? Because to me, I see the ruling class. If you are successful, Sam, I think they're just gonna light the rule book on fire. Like, they learn from their mistakes. Do you have any thoughts? Do you have anything you want to add before I show you guys any more receipts?
Yeah, no, that to the extent that they want international institutions to exist, they want to instrumentalize them. Yes. So that they can have UN cover for when they invade Iraq, or when they put sanctions on Russia. They want to use international law so that they can go before their own public and say, you know, what we're doing is totally legit here. But they don't actually, the last thing they actually want is actual law that actually applies equally to all parties and will scrutinize their own criminality as well as anybody else's. So we could end up going down a road where they will seek, as you say, to burn it down. If I understood you correctly, and you actually had, you had the visual of one of the Israeli ministers spoke at the UN last year, and he had a little copy of the UN Charter in a little paper shredder, and he shredded it. He said, "This is what you're doing. And I'm like, "No, you're doing it, you're literally doing it, and you're accusing other people of doing it." That Israel is sort of the tip of the spear of the U.S. establishment, attempting to totally dismantle international law, and totally make it and you have parts of the establishment like Eric Prince, who's the founder of what used to be called Blackwater, which was instrumental in the invasion of Iraq, and his weapons mercenary firm and all of that. He's outright calling for a new colonialism. We don't need to pretend with neo-colonialism and corporatism anymore. Let just go full hog and have a full-blown new colonialism in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and so on. So I think that is an option, and they could be using that as a threat to other countries to say, you got to give us most of what we want through the UN, or we're going to burn it all down. That could well be part of their, if you want to call it, negotiating or blackmail or threatening posture towards the rest of the planet.
So this is the bipartisan AIPAC, and liberals love AIPAC. This is the messaging that not just coming from the far right, guys. Like, it's a coordinated attack by the ruling class in order to destroy the international law that is restraining their bloodthirsty ruling class members. Because I think they look at the previous generations of the ruling class. They see the Geneva Conventions, and they're like, "What the fuck would you guys doing?"
Right.
But I get the strategy, but obviously we know they weaponize that kind of stuff. But they're like, why would we even agree to this fucking shit? It's to the current generation of the ruling class. It's absurd that they will ever show any sort of restraint. You know what I mean? You can make the argument. I get this is me being very loose with the previous generations, but you can say that they was legitimately traumatized after tens of millions of people who died, and they was like, maybe I'm being pretty naive there, but you can see them like, all right, man, we gotta put some fucking rules on the book. But the current generation of ruling class, they think that's ridiculous.
Right.
And you go ahead, Sam.
Yeah, I think it's because they think that they got a united West, right? NATO gives them a united Europe and United States. So, I mean, they set up the Geneva Convention and everything because, you had wars between, France and Britain and Germany, So once when the European powers started fighting each other, they decided, okay, we got to have rules. But now, if they're not going to be fighting each other, and if they're unified against, other people around the world, then they can decide what you're saying. Well, maybe we don't need the rules anymore. And we can just, have at it and throw out the rule book. And that is, one of my big questions to Miller, and I reiterated it, to Blinken, was, do you recognize the Geneva Conventions as applying to the Palestinians?
Yeah.
And the Biden people, now I haven't had a chance to ask this. I'm back in, they're letting me back in. They're not calling on me, or I've only gotten one question in under Trump. So Trump might just say, yeah, hell with the Geneva Conventions. But under Biden, I had several go-arounds with them about it, and they would never say, we do not recognize the Geneva Conventions. They would evade or, deceitfully respond to it. But if you really look at it closely, it's clearly their policy to say, we will not recognize it. And actually, sometimes when you ask them that question, this is a really it shows how they lie. When I asked them, do you recognize the Geneva Conventions? One time they said, we recognize Israel has the right to defend itself.
Yeah.
Which you hear all the time, but really think about what that says, because when you're talking about, obviously Israel, it's a state, it has a right to defend itself from Syria or Lebanon or Saudi Arabia or Turkey or whoever, but it's occupying the Palestinian people. And under that set of circumstances, Israel does not have a right to defend itself. Under international law, it has a right to maintain order as an occupying power. When Germany was occupying France during World War II, it did not have a right to defend itself. Under the Geneva Conventions, if you're an occupying power, you do not have a right to defend yourself from the people that you're occupying. So in effect, what they are saying, and what everybody who says Israel has a right to defend itself, whether they're aware of it or not, they're parroting a statement that in effect says the Geneva Conventions do not apply to Israel.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm not an international scholar, but I read a little bit, and the entire idea. I could even make a legal argument that Yemen is in the right. I think.
Yeah.
I can make an argument that if any Arab nation attacked Israel, they would be in the right, because the creation of Israel was contingent on the creation of the Palestinian state. So as long as Israel blocks the creation of the Palestinian state, they are out of compliance with the UN. Okay, that's not enough, right? What about when you engage in genocide?
Correct.
So when you engage in genocide, everyone who's a signatory to the Geneva Conventions, they have an obligation.
And the Genocide Convention. Yeah.
They have an obligation to do everything they can to stop the genocide, like Yemen engaging a blockade. So in that sense,
correct.
That just show how out of that's the main argument that we got to use, and that's what I always hammer Zionists with. We gotta hammer them with the fact that Israel is inherently out of compliance with international law.